Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to FPCI Public Forum. This forum is brought to you by Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia and the EU Delegation in Indonesia. I'm Aska from FPCI Chapter BINUS University. Today, we are delighted to have my fellow university students joining us here in person, coming from BINUS University, University of Indonesia, Paramadina University, Jayabaya University, and Universitas 17 Agustus 1945. Also welcome to those who are tuning in online from FPCI YouTube channel at Secretariat FPCI. Today's forum is entitled EU's Indo-Pacific Strategy and What It Means to the Region. An interesting and timely topic for us all, especially among us, the IR students. And for that, we are honored to host the event with Mr. Richard Tibbels as our speaker. He is the European Union Special Envoy to the Indo-Pacific. Welcome, Mr. Richard Tibbels. Everybody, please give a warm round of applause to Mr. Richard Tibbels. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let us now begin our forum. And for that, I would like to hand the floor to the moderator, the founder and chairman of Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia, Dr. Dino Patijalo. Dr. Dino, you may take over.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and I hope you're not skipping class, right? Good. I'm very honored on behalf of FPCI and all the students in the room to welcome Mr. Richard Tibbels, the EU Special Envoy on Indo-Pacific, who is on a visit of ASEAN countries. Yeah, he's visiting Jakarta, Bangkok, and Manila. And his job, of course, is to touch base with the countries in the Indo-Pacific, in the region, to talk about common interests that we can do together as fellow Indo-Pacific nations, and also to communicate our views, our perspectives, our interests to Brussels, where he resides. Yeah. EU has developed an Indo-Pacific strategy, which means now we have a rich variety of concepts and ideas about this region where Indonesia and ASEAN belongs and is at the heart of, and what we can expect to see this region move towards in the future, right? EU is an important partner in the region, important partner for Indonesia, for ASEAN, and for countries in the Indo-Pacific. And EU, I'm sure, sees the future of the world as a world whereby growth and prosperity and security in the Indo-Pacific will be ever more critical to the world order, right? So having said that, I would like to give the opening statements to Richard, and afterwards I may have some questions, but I want all of you to just start thinking about what are the things you want to ask Mr. Richard. And let's have an easy, relaxing, and fun conversations, yeah? And who knows, you can use this discussion for your essays for your school as well, yeah? Okay, Mr. Richard, the floor is yours.
Dino, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, delighted to see so many of you in the room and watching by video as well. As Dino said, I am the special envoy of the EU to the Indo-Pacific. I took up my role in September of last year, so this is still a relatively new job for me. My role is double, really. It is to work with EU institutions, with EU member states, to mobilize our resources to engage and ensure an effective presence in the Indo-Pacific and with Indo-Pacific partners. And it's also to do what I'm doing now, which is to visit Indo-Pacific countries, engage with governments, and also with civil society, think tanks, and most importantly, the youth of the Indo-Pacific, which is obviously one of your strong points and really one of the things I think that we want to capitalize on as we move forward. As Dino said, I'm these days in Jakarta, naturally the first place to visit. When on a visit to ASEAN countries, Indonesia has the chair of ASEAN at the moment. I will then move on to Thailand, to Bangkok, and then complete my visit on this occasion by visiting Manila. The Philippines is the country which is the coordinator for the EU within ASEAN. So that explains a little bit why I'm going to these three countries. Dino mentioned the EU strategy for the Indo-Pacific. We are keen to cooperate, and that's the key word in the strategy is cooperation. We recognize that this region is of ever-increasing strategic importance. A few statistics to illustrate that. The Indo-Pacific is the second largest destination for EU goods. The EU is the top foreign direct investment partner of the region. 1/3 of global trade goes through the South China Sea, and 40% of EU trade does so. And over recent years, we've seen growing geopolitical rivalry and tensions in the Taiwan Strait, over freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, and obviously since last autumn we've seen an increasing number of missile launches from North Korea. I mentioned cooperation, so this is why our strategy is very much wide-ranging. We have 7 priority areas: sustainable and inclusive prosperity, green transition, ocean governance, digital governance and partnerships, connectivity, security and defense, and human security. And our approach is to try and work with all partners of the region who want to cooperate with us. We've got a second strategic document which we issued last year, which is called the EU Strategic Compass. This is our document guiding our security and defense policy as we go forward in this increasingly competitive and geopolitically tense period. And the Indo-Pacific region is highlighted as an important focus of our work going forward. When I look at the conclusions we draw from these 2 strategies, we say that the EU cannot separate economics from security. The 2 go hand in hand. Secondly, we live in one strategic theatre. European security and the security of the Indo-Pacific are linked, and therefore our prosperity is also. And third, the conclusion we draw from that is the EU must reinforce its presence and strengthen its engagement with all Indo-Pacific partners. My boss, the High Representative and Vice President of the Commission, Josep Borrell, often says that there is now no far away in a globalized world. And Russia's war against Ukraine is not just a European war, it's a full frontal assault on the UN Charter and the rules-based international order. And we also feel that the 4 February 2022 declaration by Russia and China of a friendship without limits, and China's subsequent stance on Russia's engagement highlights the global nature of the challenge that we now face. And just as Russia's aggression against Ukraine, we believe, is of concern to all countries in the Indo-Pacific region, so we believe that tensions in the Taiwan Strait, in the South China Sea, and caused by the missile launches in North Korea are of direct concern to the EU as well. Our approach is very much one based on partnership and cooperation, and all we do in the region is very much focused on that. Our trade agreements, our digital and green partnerships are not just sectoral or economic measures, but they are designed to strengthen stability, security, and the rules-based international order. The other document of the EU that I wish to mention is the Global Gateway Initiative of December 21. And this is our offer to help build diversified and secure supply chains and to unlock sustainable developments in partner countries of mutual interest to the EU and the countries of the Indo-Pacific. We are now preparing for a further EU ministerial forum on the Indo-Pacific. The first round was held in February last year in Paris. Now the Swedish presidency of the EU will be holding a further round in May, and this will bring together the ministers of the EU member states with ministers of foreign affairs of the Indo-Pacific countries, and will provide an occasion to push forward our joint agenda. So what does all of this mean for ASEAN at one level and Indonesia at the other level? We believe that this year, the year of Indonesia's chairmanship of ASEAN, is very, very important. We've seen the plans of the Indonesian government to hold 4 events on the Indo-Pacific during this year, and we're very much keen to see how the events, notably in the margins of the ASEAN summit in September, might drive forward ASEAN's Indo-Pacific outlook, and we're keen to see how the EU can contribute to that exercise. When we look at our strategy and when we look at the ASEAN outlook for the Indo-Pacific, we see huge commonalities, and this provides the basis upon which we can do more. And last December, the EU and ASEAN held a commemorative summit, and the commitments that we took at that meeting will also carry forward our cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. There was a commitment by the EU to contribute 10 billion via the Global Gateway, and this is now moving ahead. ASEAN is central to our work on the transition to a green, low-carbon, eventually zero-carbon economy, and we're keen to use also ASEAN as a vehicle for encouraging connectivity between the EU and Southeast Asia. And we've adopted 2 practical measures, a Green Team Europe initiative and a Team Europe initiative on sustainable connectivity. What do we mean by Team Europe? This is our holistic approach, combining the efforts of EU institutions, member states, and the private sector and the financial institutions to bring forward really useful, sustainable projects of benefit for all. Let me also refer to the Comprehensive Air Transport Agreement, which we agreed recently between the EU and ASEAN. This is unique. It's the first block-to-block air liberalization agreement, and will encourage trade between the EU and ASEAN countries, and also encourage people-to-people contacts. And hopefully you can benefit from that yourself in the future, potentially doing research sessions in Europe, or just going to visit as tourists. Together with these actions at the ASEAN level, we are developing cooperation with other partners. We have digital partnerships with Japan, Korea, and Singapore, and connectivity partnerships with Japan and India. Let me refer to the security field, because this is one area where the External Action Service, where I sit, is leading. We have a project called CRIMARIO, that stands for Critical Maritime Routes in the Indo-Pacific, and this is designed to enable our partners to have a better understanding of what's going on at sea. There's a lot of risks to freedom of navigation. There's a lot of illegal activities, whether it's fishing or the trafficking of people or drugs, and we've come up with a platform of information sharing which can help our partners understand what's going on. We have 33 countries cooperating with this initiative, including Indonesia and Philippines in the Southeast Asia region. We also have other projects in the field of counterterrorism, cybersecurity, maritime cooperation and crisis management. This is our project called Enhancing Security in and with Asia. We've also seen joint naval exercises between our operation in the Northwest Indian Ocean, Operation Atalanta, and a variety of partners, including Indonesia. Now, if I turn to the Indonesian level, Indonesia is a key partner for the EU. Connectivity, I've already mentioned, is one of the themes we're looking to develop. We have a regional railway project being carried out by Germany to enhance and upgrade the electrification of suburban railways. Green transition, we're looking now to implement the project which was developed in the context of the G7, between G7 partners and Indonesia, called the Joint Energy Transition Partnership, and we will be contributing to the implementation of that with the objective of phasing out fossil fuels over the long run and providing models for circular economy. And these will be taken forward through the Green Team Europe initiative in Indonesia. Let me finally mention perhaps the most important bilateral effort which is ongoing, and this is the negotiation of a free trade agreement, the Comprehensive Economic and Partnership Agreement. This will really open up trading possibilities both ways. So by negotiating a high standard trading agreement, it will enable Indonesian firms to export to the EU, and likewise it will allow European companies to invest more easily in Indonesia. Our leaders, President von der Leyen of the European Commission and the Indonesian President, have agreed to try and conclude such negotiations by the end of this year, and our trade negotiators are working hard with that objective. So that's really what I wanted to say by way of introduction. I have to say that I am here to listen as much as to preach about what the EU is doing, and I really value the opportunity today to listen to the young people of Indonesia. I'd be very interested to hear how you, as the youth of Indonesia, see the perception of the EU in Indonesia. What does the EU mean for you? And I'd also like to hear your ideas about what we can do more with our Indonesian counterparts to enhance cooperation at EU Indonesia and EU ASEAN level. So thanks very much, everyone, and looking forward to a very stimulating debate.
Let's give a big hand for Pat Richard. Yeah. And now let's go to Starbucks downstairs. Pat Richard, let me just follow up with a couple of questions while the students figure out what they want to ask you. What is the label that you put on the EU Indo-Pacific strategy? The Indians call theirs free and open. Obviously, the Americans do so, free and open Indo-Pacific. For ASEAN, free, open, inclusive, and then cooperation, so 4 terms. Yeah. What would be the labels that the EU have on Indo-Pacific? Yeah.
I took up the job in September. Since I'd taken up the job, I've seen Canada come up with a strategy for the Indo-Pacific. I've seen South Korea come up with a strategy for the Indo-Pacific. And I have to say that there is great similarity between all of the strategies that have so far been developed. I think we're all looking for a free, open, stable, prosperous, inclusive, cooperative region within which to operate. So for the EU, I think cooperation is in the title of our strategy, so that's really the key word. We want to look at what we can do rather than what we can prevent in the region. So we're looking for inclusive cooperation with all of those who are ready to work with us.
Okay. For Indonesia, I think when we use the term inclusive, and for ASEAN as well, is the code word for China. right? Meaning there cannot be any regional order that excludes one of the largest countries in the region. I'm just wondering, in the EU use of the term inclusive, is that also a code word for China, or is that something else? Yeah.
We don't want to exclude anyone. Our focus, I think, will be on those with whom we can cooperate more, but that doesn't mean just limiting ourselves to our traditional like-minded partners. We definitely want to move beyond our like-minded friends to work with every partner in the Indo-Pacific region where we can establish mutual interests. Our Indo-Pacific strategy runs alongside our approach to China, and you know that our approach to China consists of 3 notions. We see China as a partner in those areas where we can work together. We see it as a competitor, and we see it as a systemic rival. And I won't hide from you, as you probably know, that the notions of competition and systemic rivalry are now more to the fore than the notion of partnership. But once again, the notion of inclusivity and the notion of China being a partner where we can identify joint interests is very much on the table.
So let me just try to imagine a scenario. In the Cambodian ASEAN summit last time, they agreed that they wanted to start operationalizing in the Indo-Pacific, meaning that let's start getting into some concrete cooperation. And I think Indonesia's chairmanship wants to do just that, just to make sure that there's actual practical cooperation within the Indo-Pacific. So I guess my question would be, and I'm sorry if this is a bit difficult to answer, if you're not ready to answer this, please say so, it's fine. But if there is a cooperation where China is involved, would the EU work with China on the Indonesian-led project of cooperation within the context of AOIP?
I mean, I don't want to prejudge decisions that will have to be taken in the future. I would say that we're very keen to see the world moving towards a zero carbon world. And it's quite clear that the biggest economies of the world, the US, India, and China, are going to have to play a part in achieving that objective. So if there is an opportunity to work with all partners in an Indo-Pacific setting on achieving that objective, then I would see that we would be open to that, provided, if you like, it respects the standards of sustainability, which we see as being vital for a successful green transition.
Okay. You know, if you ask Indonesians, if you poll Indonesians what things they worry most about international relations, I think many of them would pick rivalries, yeah. And obviously Europe is at war now, and the geopolitical competition, rivalry, and contest is strongest there relative to any other parts of the world. And you mentioned that EU now has an Indo-Pacific strategy, and then the elements of rivalry also that you have with some countries in the region. I'm just wondering, what would you say to Indonesians or Southeast Asians that, look, EU's Indo-Pacific strategy is not going to bring up more rivalries in the region? Yeah. How can you assure that? Or you can't assure that? Yeah.
I mean, I think our objective is not to create confrontation. It is very much to focus on cooperation. We're in the business of negotiating trade agreements to tie everyone together in high standard commitments to boost our economies. We're in the business of supporting countries move towards a green and digital future. We're keen to establish effective governance in oceans, and our role in the security and defense field is very much to support countries to reinforce their own efforts to protect their own interests. We see, and we look at Ukraine in this respect, we see national sovereignty and territorial integrity as the basis for a stable world. This is being put under great threat by Russia at the moment. What we don't want is for large countries on other continents to copy Russia and to intimidate, threaten, or occupy other countries on other continents. So we, in our whole operation, want to provide the countries with elements which can strengthen their capacity to act in their own interests, in their citizens' interest, and to diversify their economies so that they cooperate with many partners around the world and share the risk.
Okay. Pak Richard, Europe is unique compared to other countries in that it has a colonial history, right, with regard to the world and also to Southeast Asia and to Indonesia as well. Yeah? Many Southeast Asian countries, except Thailand, has been colonized at one point or another by a European country. I'm just wondering, what is your message? I mean, there's still a flavor of that to some segments of people in Indonesia, in Southeast Asia, even in India. I was just there last week. There's still a flavor of that, no matter how much their relations with the West has changed. Right? So I'm just saying, I want to ask you, what would you say to the people in the Indo-Pacific? Look, that's totally gone, or any flavor of that is not going to be coloring our approach to the Indo-Pacific and that. I say this only because in public discourse, that's still mentioned. Yeah, that still left some degree of feeling among certain parts of the population.
I have to say, since I took up the job in September, I have been surprised by the degree to which Europe's colonial history still resonates in the Indo-Pacific region and still forms a part of the foreign policy thinking of countries here. As you can see by my grey hair, I'm not exactly as young as you lot, but I grew up in post-colonial Europe. So for my generation and every generation that has succeeded me, we do not regard ourselves as Europeans as colonialists. We think that is the history of our parents, our grandparents, and previous generations. The European Union, if you like, is par excellence a structure which is designed to ensure cooperation between countries and to ensure increasing integration, which can avoid war between ourselves and can ensure a peaceful future. So I have to say, from speaking very personally, I don't see Europeans as colonialists anymore. Now, we may have an issue where we try and project our degree of integration and our regulatory cooperation with other countries, and when we ask countries to follow our standards. Now, I realize that if you have been colonized, you could potentially see our new efforts to try and do good in the world by having high standard agreements as an intention to preach to countries about how they should conduct themselves. But I sincerely believe that may be an issue, and we can discuss about that, and that's why I'm here. It's why our delegation in Jakarta and our delegations around the world are in constant dialogue with our partner countries to explain what we are doing amongst the 27 EU member states and what we would like to do in terms of partnership with other countries but I sincerely believe that this has got nothing to do with our colonial history. But I have to say that I'm listening, and I think everyone who deals with the Indo-Pacific has to take into account the perceptions of the Indo-Pacific countries and the historical legacy which still resonates here and elsewhere. But believe me, I think there is only one country which is colonizing or trying to colonize at the moment, and that is Russia. What it is doing is to try and re-establish what it calls its so-called historical lands, and this is a typical kind of colonial attitude, and this is why we believe that all of the countries have had a colonial history imposed upon them should support us, who see the defense of Ukraine as a matter of respect for national sovereignty and territorial integrity.
Pak Richard, you mentioned about EU's Indo-Pacific strategy covering the area of security and defense. I think that was point number 6 or 7. We've been hearing a lot also about NATO greater attention towards Asia. Yeah, Japan and Korea are opening office in Brussels with regard to NATO. The Japanese Prime Minister were invited to NATO summit, and I think there's more attention being paid by NATO on affairs in the Indo-Pacific. I'm just wondering, to what extent is the EU Indo-Pacific strategy coordinated with NATO? And I know you don't speak for NATO, but do you see greater NATO engagement in the Indo-Pacific? And as an Indonesian, I would like to say, you want to know what we think, right? I hope not, right? We got enough problems, we got enough strategic rivalries here, and the last thing we need is to have NATO coming in this region and bringing NATO issues to the Indo-Pacific. EU, we like because you bring trade, investment, infrastructure, people to people, and so on. But back to that question, how much coordination between the EU and NATO on Indo-Pacific?
Thanks very much. I mean, obviously, both organizations have their headquarters in Brussels.
Yes.
So it's not as if we don't talk with each other. And obviously what you should recognize is that the membership of both organizations has a lot of commonality. So when you talk about the EU and NATO, you're talking about the member states. Having said that, NATO is an organization with a very well-defined mandate, talking about the self-defense, coming to the defense of each other. That's its main job. It's a defensive alliance. It's not about projecting force elsewhere. It's about ensuring...
Except in Serbia and Libya.
It's about ensuring the defense of its members and its way of life. So exchanges of view, yes. Coordination, I think, is going too far.
By the way, we are at FPCI, we are going to have a session, I think in April, called What Does NATO Want with Asia? So that will be interesting, just the extent to which NATO is thinking on areas beyond the North Atlantic. I want to open questions now to the students here. Okay, that gentleman in the middle, on the right, and I want to get a lady. Is there a lady? Okay, a lady in blue. So let's start with 3 first, and then we can follow up later. After that, yeah. Gentleman in the middle, can you say your name and your affiliation, please?
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Dino and Mr. Richard. My name is Dafa from Paramadina University. Simple question, talking about Crimario. Critical maritime routes in the Indian Ocean, how significant the involvement of ASEAN as regional organization, or maybe Southeast Asia as whole region in this program, especially Indonesia? Is there anything to do with South China Sea? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dafa. The guy on my right, here, you can use my...
Thank you, Pak. My name is Rizky from BINUS University, and my question will be around the idea that EU is trying to extend its influence and also its cooperation in the region, right, Pak? And is EU doing a greater, is EU extending its influence over Asia to make a better leadership compared to other like-minded countries, Pak? So is EU being a leader in this case? Thank you, Pak.
Thank you. Lady in the middle.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity. My name is Gracia. I'm from University of Indonesia. And my question is, I'm actually particularly interested when you mentioned the 7 priorities of EU. I totally can see the commonalities with ASEAN 4 priority areas for the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, namely connectivity and sustainable development. And from that, you have also mentioned in your introduction earlier about EU commitment of 10 billion for the region. So with that aid, I believe EU can have a say regarding Indo-Pacific region strategy in form of suggestion, of course. So my question, from ASEAN 4 priority areas, connectivity, maritime, sustainable development, and economic cooperation, which area would EU suggest should ASEAN, under Indonesian chairmanship, should be focusing on more that can potentially show maximum benefits of cooperation, and why? Thank you.
Okay. Maybe the gentleman on, yes. Somebody give him a microphone.
Thank you for the opportunity. I would like to rewind it for a bit.
Do you have a name?
Yeah, I'm Gentar Fiandragasta from London School of Public Relations. I would like to ask, despite the relationship that EU and Indonesia has developed, somehow, as mentioned, China is still involved in our economically in Indonesia. And that you mentioned economy is one of the aspects of this strategy that we're talking about. Is there any walls between EU and China in order for EU to implement these strategies in the future with Indonesia? And if there is a wall, how will you overcome it so that we can still work together? Thank you.
Fantastic questions. Thanks very much for them. Crimario is about working with partner countries throughout the Indo-Pacific region. It's about enhancing the capacities of the naval and maritime authorities of the partner countries in the field of maritime domain awareness is the technical term for it. So it's to enable your naval and maritime authorities to know what's going on at sea. So in fact, Crimario goes beyond, and the IORIS platform for information sharing goes beyond the Indo-Pacific, and we have cooperation arrangements with other countries outside the Indo-Pacific as well. So wherever partner countries' maritime authorities are active, our project can be useful, whether that's in the South China Sea or elsewhere. So that's, I think, my answer to the first question. On the second question, I think there are 2 parts to this. One is that we believe the EU has a distinctive role to play in the Indo-Pacific region. As I said, we can negotiate and conclude trade agreements. Other partners find that difficult. We are leaders in the green agenda, the transition towards a zero carbon economy. Our leadership in the COP negotiations, I think, is well recognized throughout the world. So there are a number of areas, I think, where we have, if you like, comparative advantages over others. However, we do not see ourselves in opposition to other players in the Indo-Pacific. And as I said during my introduction, when I look at all of the Indo-Pacific strategies that have been agreed and published so far, there is huge similarity between all of them. So I think we are all seeking more or less the same thing, okay, with different emphasis in certain cases, but we're all seeking to ensure that the Indo-Pacific remains a peaceful, stable and prosperous region. It is such an economically dynamic region that it's vital for the whole world that we all play a part in ensuring its continued peace and stability. On question, the next question, which is what does the EU think should be the priority areas out of the 7 priority areas? I was hoping you were going to tell me what you think Indonesia and ASEAN priorities should be going forward. As I said, I think we have these Team Europe initiatives, as we call them, which were agreed at the EU-ASEAN summit in the field of connectivity and in the field of green transition. And those, I think, are the areas where I think we're likely to be focusing on most closely in the coming period. And besides that, I said with Indonesia, we will be trying to conclude the trade negotiations this year, so that, like with Singapore and Vietnam, we have another ASEAN member state which has a modern, up-to-date, comprehensive and ambitious trade agreement. And then the final question was, if I've understood correctly, is there a wall between cooperation between the EU and China in the Indo-Pacific, and what can we do to bring down that wall? Well, let me try and summarize again what I said earlier on to one of Dino's questions. I think we are looking for inclusive cooperation, open to cooperate with anyone where we can find mutual interests. And if China is ready to work with us, as I said, for example, on climate action, I think another area is debt relief, because there are quite a few countries now which are suffering from the economic difficulties and debt issues, and partly due to the way China has financed its BRI, and partly due to the economic downturn due to COVID and the Russian aggression. I think if there's a way to work with China in those 2 fields, that would be a way of being beneficial to all the countries of the Indo-Pacific. Thanks.
Okay. Actually, maybe if I can add some comments on that. You asked us what we think would be helpful for EU to do. From my standpoint, a couple of things. One is, would like EU to be a force for peace in the region, and I don't mean this rhetorically, because we have one very good example. Remember, what is the worst conflict we've had in Indonesia? One of the worst. You remember, guys? Aceh, remember? I really thought, well, maybe you weren't born. I don't know how old you guys are, but there was a moment in my life where I thought we would never resolve the Aceh Aceh conflict. Yeah. But it got resolved, and EU was a very strong partner in that. And in fact, EU sent military observers to observe that the peace would hold. So those kind of things, there's plenty of other conflicts where EU can play a similar role. Yeah. So that's one. Secondly, when I was in the diplomatic service, Richard, there was so many reference and actions on confidence building measures, CBM, right? For some reason, in the last few years, I don't hear that anymore, right? Everybody just talks about rivalry, competition, not enough on CBM, confidence building measures. And as you know, CBM can lead to a lot of good things. Yeah, it can change conflict or dispute towards a more cooperative and peaceful resolution. So maybe more EU action on CBM in the region. I'm sure you've done some. There's already military exercise with Indonesia and EU. That's a form of CBM. Yeah. So that's good. And another thing is. Now the theme of Global South is resurging, right? So when I was in India at Raisina, there's a lot of talk about now the new force in the world is Global South. I mean, you saw Qatar hosting the World Cup. Saudi wants to be this and that. Emirates now is the COP28 chair. And then ASEAN says we are the epicentrum of growth in the world, and so on. So there's a lot of confidence and movement within the developing world. I think there's a lot that EU can synergize with the Global South. And I say this because If you ask an American on Global South, they will shrug away from it because, you know, SDG and Global South is not an American foreign policy thing, right? I don't need to explain why, but that's just the way it is, right? So I think Europe can play a big role in that. So I think those two things, being a force for peace, CBM, confidence building measures, and then synergizing more and even empowering the Global South.
Thanks very much. I mean, I think I agree with that. It's good that you mentioned Aceh. Naval exercises are indeed a form of confidence building measure, and we hope that as we pursue our policy of having a more coherent and consistent presence of EU naval vessels in the region. We're starting off in the Northwest Indian Ocean with the concept of coordinated maritime presence, which we've taken from another part of the world, the other side of Africa, in the Gulf of Guinea. What we're trying to do is to make sure that EU member states' navies coordinate their travel plans so that we can have an EU naval vessel present ideally at all times in the region. So this is presence, it is cooperating with partner countries when we visit and so forth. On the Global South, a part of our response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been, in addition to supporting Ukraine, in addition to putting pressure on Russia to withdraw its forces, the third element of our action has been to support countries around the world in coping with the effects of Russia's aggression in terms of food security, energy security, and economic difficulties. So we are very much keen on working with countries in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, to offset the effects of Russia's aggression and to more long-term ensure the economic development of all developing countries.
Thank you. Anyone else? Let's take the second round of questions. Dina, by the way, kita sampai jam berapa? 4 o'clock? 10 more minutes, okay. She's the boss. She's the control of the time. All right, you got Dina and then 3 more. And the lady in the, yes, and then the lady behind and the guy on the left. So I like this. It's a female-dominated round, yeah, the way it should be. Yes. Okay, Dina.
Thank you for the opportunities, Mr. Richard Tibbels. My question is, one of the global gateway program that EU have in Indonesia, it's very interesting that you guys engage with the smart city, green smart city, which currently happen in Banyuwangi and Banyumas, if I'm not mistaken. So I think this is a very good initiative to engage with local government, and I'm wondering if the EU have future projects in the local government engagement in Indonesia, and what kind of projects in the being put place in the future.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
The lady in the front, yes.
Hi, my name is Amalia Patricia Nira, and I'm from BINUS University. My question is that, as we all are aware of the rising economic power of China, especially with the latest alliance of Brazil, Iran, and many more, and that ASEAN over the years has been dependent on China being a big trading partner, especially with the Belt Road Initiative. How can EU's diversified free trade strategy be distinct to the BRI initiative? And how can Europe expect trade gains? And how will Indonesia or any other ASEAN countries benefit from this?
Okay, the lady behind you.
Thank you.
Greetings, Mr. Tibbels and Mr. Dino. Thank you for the chance to ask. One of the priority areas which included in the EU strategy is security and defense. What I would like to know is what would be the EU's position if a major conflict or war in the Indo-Pacific, which may involve EU partners, may happen, and will EU entangled in this? If yes, how far would EU be willing to entangle politically, economically, or even military? Thank you.
Okay, and then final question from the guy next to you. Thank you.
Greetings, Mr. Tibbels and Pak Dino. Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Georges Brian from BINUS University. Firstly, I would like to thank you for the great insight mentioned earlier about the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy. Previously, we have heard a lot about the security matters, including the South China Sea dispute, cooperation in combating illegal activities at sea, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. However, I would like to ask about the European Union strategy in solving the political crisis in Myanmar, as currently Myanmar's political instability remains a challenge to achieve regional stability in ASEAN. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Great questions again. I'm extremely pleased to be with you this afternoon, I have to say. You're right, green smart cities is something we're trying to do across the world. We have, I'm not sure whether it is worldwide, I think it is worldwide, we have this notion of covenant of mayors, where the EU works with city authorities throughout the world in trying to encourage urban areas to move towards a green and smart future. It's very good that we're already doing some of those activities in Indonesia. We don't impose ourselves on Indonesia, so it will require discussions with Indonesian authorities both centrally and locally to decide what the priorities of EU action are and to see what the possibilities are of further extension of the notion of green and smart cities into Indonesia. But I think it's been one of the success stories of the EU in many parts of the world, and with so many countries urbanizing so quickly, I think it really is a priority both for the countries concerned. The EU is also, second question, the EU is also a huge trading partner of China, and it's certainly not our intention or our ability to decouple from China. It will remain an important economic partner of the EU, and obviously it will be for the countries of the Indo-Pacific as well. What we want to try and ensure is that countries have options, and that the EU represents one of the options for the countries of the Indo-Pacific, with the distinctive features of doing business with the EU, which will be high standards, which will allow you access to a market of 500 million citizens of Europe, quite well off in comparative terms worldwide, so you can expect good prices for your goods. And in fact, I think what we're looking for is that by encouraging high standard trades is that we bring countries up so that countries move away from, if you like, trade in raw materials and basic products, and that we enhance the value chains of our trading system so that we bring up countries to more sophisticated levels of trade and development. And that's, I think, what is one of the main features of the EU. This is a two-way street, by the way. This is your region is also a sophisticated region, and so we will be learning from you and taking advantage of the possibilities that you offer us to enhance our economies as well. I don't want to give the impression that this is a one-way street, far from it. Third question, I don't want to get into hypotheticals, of course, about how the EU would respond to a particular crisis situation, but let me repeat the point. that just as we think Russia's aggression against Ukraine is a matter for all countries on all continents, so we believe tensions in the Taiwan Strait, freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, the risk of nuclear proliferation, missile launches by North Korea are of direct concern to the EU as well. So we will be working with other international partners to try and mitigate the risks of tensions in the areas that I've mentioned, but I don't want to get into speculation about what would happen in a particular scenario, of course. I'm glad there was a question about Myanmar, because obviously we see this as one of the things which hinder greater cooperation between ASEAN countries and greater cooperation between ASEAN and the EU. The EU is firmly behind the 5-point consensus which ASEAN has developed. We will be in close consultations with Indonesia during its chairmanship of ASEAN to see how we can support Indonesia in its efforts to implement the 5-point consensus. The humanitarian situation is appalling, and the EU is ready at all times, if the conditions were right, to use its humanitarian efforts to alleviate the appalling situation of people in Myanmar. Our ambassador to ASEAN, based here in Jakarta, is also our envoy for matters relating to Myanmar, and he is reaching out to Indonesia on a regular basis to provide that good coordination between what we can do and Indonesia's leadership efforts during its presidency of ASEAN.
I think we can go on for another hour, but we have run the end of the session. I just want to have one final observation. Yeah? I think the fact that EU now has an Indo-Pacific strategy is a validation of this notion that Indo-Pacific in the 21st century will be a very big, important, and dynamic region. Yeah, and look, in the past few weeks or months, I've traveled through many points in the Indo-Pacific, India last week, but I was also in Malaysia, I was in Cambodia, I was Thailand, and other points. And you know what I see? I see something that I did not see 30 or 40 years ago. You know what it is? Confidence, right? Percaya diri, right? And I give you one admission that my previous generation did not want to admit, but it's true. We had an inferiority complex, right? Maybe your parents will tell you the same. I see many nods. With regard to the West, right? We always thought that the West would have all the answers. When we grow up, when we develop, we want to be just like the Western countries, want to be as rich as them, as modern as them, and so on, right? But what I see now is that throughout many points in the Indo-Pacific, the society and the young people are saying, hey, we have the solutions too, right? And we can compete as well, we can compete with you and do as well as you, right? I saw this in India especially, right? They really think, hey, you know, we got the skills, we got the confidence, we're gonna conquer the world, right? So that's where we are now, yeah. That's where we are now, and the problem is, it's not only this region will become rich, like the biggest economies of the world, many of them will be coming from the Indo-Pacific. But this is also a region where there's gonna be a lot of problems, a lot of security issues, a lot of tensions, a lot of conflicts, right? The largest armies in the world are still located in the Indo-Pacific. And many of the old tensions remain there, right? If you go to Northeast Asia, to South Asia, to the Middle East, a lot of it are still there, yeah? So it's a region of promise, but it's also a region where you still have a lot of problems, and that's where you are now. This is what you are inheriting. And what we see the EU, there's only one bottom line, Richard. One bottom line. Whatever EU wants to do with Indo-Pacific. The bottom line is, does EU engagement in the Indo-Pacific, politically, strategically, economically, socially, and culturally, does it add value to peace and progress and prosperity for Indo-Pacific, right? I think the answer is clear. It does add value, yeah, but it's going to be a work in progress. Yeah, there's going to be a lot of issues, a lot of challenges, a lot of historical baggages that you know, some people will say is still there and so on. But I believe in the goodwill of EU. And I know EU aspires for leadership, especially on climate change, and you have shown that it's an effective leadership by example. Right? So we wish you all the best, and this is only part of continuing conversation between EU and the Indo-Pacific, and especially with Indonesia. Yeah. So thank you for joining us today. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Dino. Once again, everybody, please give a round of applause to Mr. Richard Tibbels and Dr. Dino Patijala for the relaxing yet very insightful and productive discussion. Okay, as we need to capture these outstanding moments, Dr. Dino, Mr. Richard, we would like to invite you to take a picture with everyone in the room. And for my fellow university students that sit on the back row, you can move forward to the back at the chairs so that the camera can capture everyone in the room.
So that's
Yes, the cameraman will be over there.
Okay.
You just need to stay seated. Yeah.
You want the colleagues to come
Yes.
behind? Yeah.
Oh, Mr. Richard asked some students to come behind.
Yes.
If anyone may, you guys can stand behind Mr. Richard and Dr. Dino.
When you leaving? Tomorrow for Bangkok.
Okay.
So no time for Bali. We could have organized a seminar in Bali or something.
Come on, everyone, you can move over here, and we're gonna take a picture.
That's what I told me after the pandemic. I get me away from Brussels.
All right, everybody look at the camera.
All right, is everyone in position? I will command the countdown for the photo.
Let's make sure my camera is there.
Okay, sure. This is what inclusivity means, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. Okay, countdown 1, 2, 3. Okay, another one, 1, 2, 3. Okay, the last one. 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Richard and Dr. Dino.